The story had always been there, passed down through my family like an old piece of furniture. Something you don't question, something that's always existed. My father told it, my grandfather before him, and even though I had heard it more times than I could count, I never really thought about it as anything more than a story. It was just one of those things, a strange piece of family history, buried in the dirt like everything else on the farm. Then, one fall, I decided to camp out in the field. I was 23 at the time, old enough to know better but still young enough to do stupid things for no real reason. I had been working the farm alongside my father, same as every year, helping him bring in the last of the corn before the cold set in. The days were long, the work was hard, and by the time the sun went down, all I wanted was a shower, a meal, and sleep. But that year, something about the backfield had been bothering me. It wasn't anything I could explain, not really, just a feeling, a kind of unease that settled into my gut every time I walked that far end of the property, the part where the land dipped low and the soil turned dark and wet. It was the oldest part of the farm, the same place my grandfather had found the body all those years ago. The man in the corn. I don't know why I decided to camp there. Maybe it was just to prove something to myself, that it was just a story, that the land was just land. Or maybe I already knew better. I packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, and a flashlight. I didn't bring a gun. I don't know why, but something about it felt wrong. Like bringing a weapon would change the nature of what I was doing. I walked out as the sun was setting, following the rows of corn as they stretched on and on, the dry stalks rustling in the wind. It was a long walk, longer than I remembered, and by the time I reached the clearing at the back end of the field, the sky was already deepening into dusk. I set up quickly, staking my tent into the soft dirt, rolling out my sleeping bag inside. The ground was damp, the air heavy with the smell of earth. I built a small fire, just enough to keep warm, and sat beside it, listening to the quiet. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The quiet. The farm was never silent, not really. There were always sounds, the chirp of insects, the distant calls of birds, the rustling of animals moving through the undergrowth. But that night there was nothing. The wind had died down, but the corn still moved, a slow, shifting sound, like something passing through the rows. Not the wind, not an animal, something heavier. I sat up, my body tensed, staring into the darkness. The fire cast flickering shadows, the stalks shifting like dark figures in the dim light. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I leaned back, trying to shake the feeling. The fire popped, sending up a brief spray of embers. I watched them drift into the night, my mind drifting too. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not loud, not hurried, just slow, deliberate steps moving through the rows. I sat up. The sound stopped. I held my breath, listening. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out. Then, after a long moment, the footsteps started again. Closer. I stood up, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned toward the field, squinting into the darkness. The corn swayed, the dry leaves whispering against each other. I told myself it had to be my father. Maybe he had come out to check on me, making sure I wasn't wasting time or being stupid. But the footsteps weren't coming from the direction of the house. They were coming from the far end of the field, from the oldest part of the farm. I reached for my knife, my fingers tightening around the handle. The steps stopped again. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then something moved, just at the edge of my vision. A shift in the darkness, a shape stepping between the rows. I turned fully, my heart pounding. Nothing. The fire behind me cast long shadows, flickering against the stalks. I strained my eyes, trying to pick out any shape, any sign of movement. Then, barely loud enough to hear, a breath. Close. Too close. I didn't think. I moved, fast, stepping back toward my tent. My foot caught on something, a root or a stone, and I stumbled, catching myself just before I fell. The moment I stopped moving, the sound started again. Footsteps, coming toward me. I turned and ran. I didn't stop to grab my bag, didn't look back. I sprinted through the darkness, the firelight shrinking behind me. My boots pounded against the dirt, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. The corn closed in on either side as I reached the rows, the stalks slapping against my arms, my legs. I pushed through, barely able to see where I was going. Behind me, I heard the footsteps break into a run. I ran faster. The rows blurred together, my hands outstretched, shoving aside stalks as I barreled through the field. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the house in the distance. I burst from the cornfield, my boots skidding on the packed dirt of the yard. I turned, breathless, staring back into the darkness. Nothing, just the field, stretching silently behind me. The stalks swayed gently in the night breeze. No movement, no sound. I stood there, shaking, waiting for something, anything, to emerge. But nothing did. The next morning, I went back. I found my campsite the way I left it. The fire had burned out, my bag still resting beside the tent. But the ground was different. Footprints, deep ones, leading from the far end of the field, right up to where I had been standing. I never camped on the farm again, and every year when planting season comes, I still find them. Tiny bean plants scattered through the field, growing where no beans were ever planted. I had been planning the trip for months, just me, my truck, and the open wilderness. I had been feeling burned out, stretched thin by work and life in general, and I needed to get away. I wasn't new to solo camping. I had done it plenty of times before, and I always found it peaceful. Something about being completely alone out in nature made me feel more like myself, like I could breathe again. I picked a spot deep in the mountains, a place far from the usual campgrounds, where I wouldn't have to worry about running into noisy tourists or weekend campers with blaring music and bright lanterns. I wanted quiet. I wanted to hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the distant sound of a river. I had studied the maps, checked the weather, made sure I had everything I needed. I packed my truck with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, cooler, enough food and water to last a few days, plus my knife and bear spray, just in case. The drive was long, winding up through back roads that turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on my map, it was late afternoon, and I was the only person for miles. I set up camp in a clearing near the tree line, with a good view of the valley below. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was perfect. I got my fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night, watching the flames flicker against the dark. At some point, I must have dozed off in my chair because I woke up suddenly. The fire burned low, the night completely still. No wind, no rustling in the trees, just silence. I stretched, got up, and banked the fire before climbing into my tent. The night was cool, and the ground was firm beneath my sleeping bag. As I zipped myself in, I felt that small flicker of unease, the kind that always comes when you're alone in the wild. Not fear, just the awareness that I was truly, completely by myself. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. No noise had woken me, no sudden movement, just that same strange feeling from earlier, like something was off. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the edge of my camp. I froze. My mind immediately went through the possibilities. An animal, maybe a deer, wandering close. A bear? But the steps weren't heavy enough for that. I stayed still, heart pounding, ears straining to pick up every sound. The footsteps circled, Not coming closer, not moving away. Just circling. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The bear spray was within reach too, but I didn't move yet. I needed to know what I was dealing with. Then, as suddenly as they started, the footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, knife in hand, waiting. But nothing else happened. No more sounds. No more movement. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a light, restless sleep. Morning came, bright and crisp, as if the night before had never happened. The fire pit was undisturbed, my gear untouched, but something felt wrong. I stood and stretched, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Not boot prints. Bare feet, pressed into the dirt around my tent, circling my camp. I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. The prints were fresh. Someone had been out here walking around my camp while I slept. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement, but the woods were still. Whoever it was, they were gone now. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They were small, not child-sized, but not large either. The toes dug into the dirt, meaning whoever it was had been moving slowly, carefully. I straightened up and took a deep breath. I didn't like this. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, every movement feeling too slow, my back prickling with the feeling of being watched. I didn't stop to eat, didn't bother with breakfast. I just needed to get out of there. As I threw the last of my stuff into the truck, I took one last look at the footprints. They were leading away from my camp now, back into the trees. But there was something else. A set of them coming back. Whoever it was had left before sunrise. But before that, at some point in the night, they had stopped circling and stood right outside my tent, listening. I got in my truck and left without looking back. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. A feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything. A raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening, my ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down, and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape, person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway, just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options. Make noise? Stay quiet? Then the zipper moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps. Walking away. Slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading from the treeline. Stopping right at my tent. Then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. I had been on the road for a long time, longer than I should have been, but that was how it always went. The money was good when the miles were high, and I was used to pushing it. That night, I was running a load of steel coils from Ohio down to Texas. A long stretch, mostly highway, not too many stops except for fuel and maybe a couple of hours of sleep if I could afford the time. The weather had been decent when I left, cold but clear, but the forecast had warned of rain turning to ice the farther south I got. That was the last thing I needed, especially hauling something as heavy as what was on my trailer. The first few 100 miles were uneventful. I ran through Kentucky, then Tennessee, making decent time. Traffic was light since it was late, and I preferred driving at night anyway. Less idiots on the road. I'd seen too many wrecks, too many people cut off an 80,000-pound truck like they had a death wish. I knew better than to get comfortable, though. Long-haul trucking has a way of lulling you into a false sense of security, and the second you start thinking nothing's going to go wrong, something does. It started just past the Arkansas border. The rain had been falling steady for a while, but the temperature was dropping, and I could feel the road getting slick under my tires. I eased up on the speed, kept a good distance from the few cars still out that late. I was on a long stretch of I-30, mostly trees on either side, no towns or exits nearby. The kind of road that can feel endless when you're tired and alone. My dash lights glowed dimly in the dark. The soft hum of the engine, the only sound besides the rain tapping against the windshield. I was about 100 miles from Texarkana when I saw the lights ahead. Red and blue flashing in the dark, reflecting off the wet pavement. A wreck, I figured. Not unusual in weather like this. As I got closer, I saw a line of trucks and cars slowing down, easing into the right lane. A couple of sheriff's cars were parked at an angle, blocking part of the road, and there was a cluster of people standing near the shoulder. I slowed to a crawl, trying to see what had happened. A jackknifed semi sat across the left lane, its trailer twisted at an angle. The cab looked mostly intact, but the front end of a smaller car was wedged underneath it, crushed almost beyond recognition. I could see first responders working around it, but from the way they moved, it was clear there was no saving whoever had been inside. I had seen enough accidents to know what that meant. Traffic was still moving, just slower, and as I crept past, I noticed something that made my stomach clench. The semi's trailer was carrying steel coils, just like mine. Heavy loads like that can be dangerous if they're not secured right. If a coil comes loose in a wreck, it'll cut through a cab like a knife through butter. I kept my eyes on the road ahead and told myself to shake it off. No use thinking about it. The rain picked up not long after that, the temperature still dropping. I kept the heat on low, just enough to keep the windshield from fogging up. My hands were starting to ache from gripping the wheel too hard, but I couldn't help it. The road was getting worse, patches of ice forming in spots, and I knew I had to be careful. I had another 300 miles to go before I could rest, and the last thing I needed was to end up like that guy back there. An hour passed, maybe more. The road stretched on, dark and empty. The only light coming from my headlights and the occasional glow of another truck in the distance. I was tired, but not enough to stop yet. I just wanted to get through the worst of the weather before I found a place to pull over. Then I saw something ahead. At first, it was just a shadow on the road, barely visible in the rain. As I got closer, I realized it was a person. They were standing in the middle of the highway. My heart jumped into my throat. I hit the brakes, careful not to lock them up on the ice, and my truck slowed with a groan. The figure didn't move, just stood there, barely illuminated by my headlights. My first thought was that it was a stranded driver, someone whose car had broken down. Maybe they had been walking to get help, and I was the first vehicle they had seen in a while. But something felt off. They weren't waving me down. They weren't moving at all. I eased onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop a few yards away. The rain was coming down harder now, the wind howling through the trees on either side of the road. I kept my lights on and tried to get a better look at the person. They were dressed in dark clothes, soaked from the rain, their heads slightly tilted down. Something in my gut told me not to get out. I sat there for a moment, engine idling, hands still gripping the wheel. Then, slowly, the person turned and walked toward the guardrail. They climbed over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond. I waited, staring at the spot where they had gone. The highway was bordered by thick woods in that area, no houses or businesses nearby. If they had a car, it wasn't anywhere I could see. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I wasn't about to go chasing someone into the woods in the middle of the night, especially in weather like this. If they needed help, there were better ways to get it than standing in the middle of the road. I reached for my radio and called it in, giving my location and a description of what I had seen. The dispatcher acknowledged it, said they'd send someone to check it out. I didn't wait. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my eyes flicking to the mirrors more often than usual. The feeling didn't leave me, that tight, uneasy knot in my stomach. I drove for another hour before I finally stopped at a truck stop near Texarkana. The rain had slowed, but the air was colder, the road still slick. I parked in the back lot, away from the other rigs, and shut the engine off. My body ached from the tension of the drive, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I sat there for a while, staring at the rain running down the windshield. The night was quiet, except for the occasional sound of another truck pulling in or leaving. I never found out who that person was. The next day, I checked the news, but there was nothing about a stranded driver or anyone found near that stretch of highway. No missing person reports that matched what I had seen. Just another cold, wet night on the road. I finished my run and moved on to the next haul, but I never stopped thinking about it. It wasn't the first strange thing I'd seen out here, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. But something about that night stuck with me in a way others hadn't. Maybe it was the way they had stood there, unmoving. Maybe it was the way they had just disappeared into the dark. Or maybe it was the fact that when I looked back at my dashcam footage the next morning, there was nothing there. Just an empty highway and the rain. I don't know why I agreed to come up here alone. Maybe I just wanted to prove something to myself, or maybe I really believed that some time away from everything would do me good. Either way, it was a mistake, a big one. It started with an offer that sounded too good to be true. A friend of a friend had a cabin deep in the woods, barely used anymore. I could stay as long as I wanted, completely free. Just bring my own supplies. No rent, no bills, no distractions. Just nature, solitude, and silence. I packed up a week's worth of food, filled up my truck, and drove 5 hours north. The last part of the trip was all dirt roads, winding through thick trees, no signs, no other cars. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of dark wood, standing in a small clearing. No power, no running water. Just a fireplace, an old gas stove, and a well outside for water. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low. I unloaded my things, locked up my truck, and carried my bags inside. The air smelled damp, like old wood and earth. There was dust everywhere, but the place was solid. The main room had a couch, a wooden table, and a fireplace. A narrow hall led to a tiny bedroom with a stiff old bed and a closet full of forgotten things. A few hunting knives, old boots, a dusty lantern. I ate a quick meal, lit a few candles, and sat in the silence. The only sound was the wind pushing through the trees, an occasional creak of the old wood settling. Felt peaceful, but the peace didn't last. I woke up in the middle of the night. No reason, just that strange, sudden wakefulness that leaves you staring at the ceiling. The cabin was silent. No wind, no animals. Just a heavy, pressing stillness. Then I heard it. Not loud, not obvious, just a faint sound outside. A slow, steady crunching, like footsteps moving through the trees. I lay still, barely breathing. Could have been a deer or a coyote. Could have been nothing. Then it stopped. I waited, listening. Silence. Minutes passed. I told myself it was nothing, forced myself to close my eyes. Eventually, I drifted off. The morning was cold, and my breath fogged in the air as I stepped outside. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, thick and dark. I walked to the well, pulled up water, and splashed some on my face. Then I saw them, footprints, clear in the dirt near the tree line, just beyond the clearing. They weren't mine, too far from the cabin, too fresh. They led from the woods to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. No return tracks, just a trail leading toward my cabin, then disappearing. I felt a tightness in my chest. Maybe a hunter? Someone passing through? That had to be it. I spent the day trying to shake the unease, chopping wood, checking my supplies. I had a rifle in the truck, but I hadn't brought much ammo. Should have brought more. Should have thought this through. The day passed slowly. By evening, I was exhausted, but I didn't want to sleep. I forced myself to eat, locked the door, and sat by the fire. The air outside felt heavier, thicker, like the forest was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The fire in the main room had burned down, leaving only faint orange flickers dancing on the walls. Then the noise came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside the cabin. I held my breath. They circled the walls, a slow, steady crunch of dirt and dead leaves. I grabbed the hunting knife from the bedside table, gripping it so hard my hand ached. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. A long silence, then the softest creak of wood. The porch. Someone was standing just feet away, on the other side of that thin wooden door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. A long moment passed. Then the footsteps retreated, slow and steady, back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that, just sat in bed, knife in hand, listening to the silence. I checked outside as soon as the sun rose. The footprints were there again, clearer this time. Heavy, deep imprints leading from the trees to my porch. I wanted to leave, should have left right then, but I didn't. Instead, I walked the perimeter of the clearing, searching for any sign of who was out there. No trails, no campsites, just untouched forest. I went back inside, locked the door, and spent the day trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Then I found something in the closet. An old hunting jacket. Nothing strange about it until I checked the pockets. Inside, wrapped in a crumpled piece of cloth, was a set of keys. Not cabin keys, car keys. I pulled out the cloth and unwrapped it completely. Something else fell out. A tooth. Human. My stomach turned. I dropped the cloth, stepped back, tried to think. Whoever had stayed here before me, something had happened to them. And now it was happening to me. I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, waiting. The fire burned low. Then, past midnight, I heard it again. But this time it was different. No footsteps, just breathing. Right outside my window. Slow, deep, steady. Someone standing just inches away, separated by only thin glass. I tightened my grip on the rifle. Then the doorknob rattled. Hard. I stood up, heart pounding, aimed the rifle at the door. Silence. Then a single knock. Slow. Hollow. Then another. Then silence. I stood there, frozen, gun shaking in my hands. Minutes passed. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Whoever it was, they were gone. I didn't wait for nightfall. At first light, I grabbed my bags, loaded the truck, and got the hell out. I didn't stop driving until I reached the first gas station, miles away. I told the clerk about the cabin. He looked at me, quiet for a moment, then just shook his head. That place, he said, no one's been up there for years. I asked him who owned it. He shrugged. Used to be a guy, lived up there alone. Then one day he just never came back. I asked what happened. He looked at me, then at the keys I'd placed on the counter. Where'd you find those? I didn't answer. I just left, and I never went back. I've always liked the quiet. Cities drain me. The noise, the crowds, the feeling that I can never be truly alone. That's why, every fall, I rent a cabin somewhere deep in the woods and spend a week away from everything. No phone, no internet, just me and the wilderness. It's something I look forward to all year. This time, I picked a spot deeper in the forest than usual. A place barely marked on the map, only reachable by a long, winding dirt road. The listing online said it was a secluded, off-grid cabin with a generator, a well for water, and a wood-burning stove. Perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking behind the thick tree line. The drive had been rough. The road was little more than a series of ruts through the dirt, and my truck struggled over rocks and dips. By the time I reached the cabin, I was relieved to get out and stretch. The place was small, just a single room with a loft for sleeping. A woodpile was stacked neatly against one wall, and the scent of pine filled the air. No neighbors, no signs of life. Just the endless stretch of forest pressing in from all sides. Exactly what I wanted. I spent the first night like I always do, lighting a fire, heating up a can of soup, and reading by lantern light. The generator worked fine, but I preferred the dim glow of the lantern. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and a distant owl called out into the darkness. Peaceful. The first strange thing happened the next morning. I woke up early, just as the sun was rising, and stepped outside to take a piss. The air was crisp, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves. As I stood there, I noticed something strange. On the dirt path leading up to the cabin, there were footprints. Not mine. I hadn't seen them the night before, and they were fresh. The dirt was still slightly damp from the morning dew, and the prints were deep. Someone had been here. My first thought was that maybe they belonged to a hunter or a hiker who had wandered close. But the prints led directly to my cabin. They stopped at the front porch, then turned around and disappeared into the woods. I didn't like that. I checked the door, still locked. Nothing inside was missing or disturbed. Maybe it had been a ranger checking on the cabin? But why wouldn't they knock? And why come in the middle of the night? I shook it off and spent the day hiking, pushing deeper into the woods, trying to enjoy the solitude. But the whole time I felt uneasy. That night, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle, just in case. Sometime around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside. A soft, deliberate crunching sound. Footsteps. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved slowly, circling the cabin. The walls were thin, and I could hear the sound of twigs snapping underfoot, the weight of someone careful not to be heard. Then silence. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for something, anything. But the night stretched on, quiet and still. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. In the morning, I found more footprints. This time, they circled the cabin completely. Someone had walked the perimeter, stopping at the windows, standing just beyond the glow of the lantern I had left burning. They had been watching me. I packed my things. I wasn't going to stay another night, not after that. I loaded my gear into my truck, turned the key, and nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I popped the hood, checked the battery, it was gone. Not dead. Removed. Someone had taken it in the night. My stomach twisted. This wasn't some accident. Someone was messing with me. I wasn't trapped, not yet. I had food, water, and a rifle in the cabin. But without my truck, I was at least 20 miles from the nearest road, and I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I decided to wait until daylight and walk out in the morning. I barricaded the door as best I could, pushed the table against it, stacked firewood in front of the windows. Then I sat by the stove, rifle in my lap, and waited. At some point in the night, I must have dozed off. A noise snapped me awake, a soft scraping sound just outside the window. I turned, barely breathing. The lantern flickered, casting weak shadows across the room. The window was small, just above the kitchen counter. Something was blocking the light, a shape, a person standing right against the glass. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Whoever was out there didn't move either, just stood there watching. Then, slowly, they reached up and tapped on the glass. Once, twice, then silence. I raised the rifle. My hands were shaking. The figure didn't react. They just stood there for another long moment before stepping away into the darkness. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I left everything behind. I grabbed my rifle, my backpack, and started walking. The forest was thick, the trees pressing in around me. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig made my pulse jump. Hours passed. I had no signal, no sense of direction except away. Then, just as the sun started sinking again, I stumbled onto a road. Not the one I had come in on, but a road. And standing there, parked in the middle of it, was an old pickup. A man stood beside it, watching me. He was older, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. I stopped, gripping the rifle. "You lost?" he asked. I hesitated, then nodded. He studied me for a long moment, then jerked his head toward the truck. "Come on, I'll get you out of here." I didn't have a choice. I climbed in. As we drove, I told him everything, the footprints, the noises, the figure at the window. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he let out a long breath. "You're lucky," he said. "Why?" I asked. He glanced at me. "Because whoever that was, they usually don't let people leave." I didn't ask anything else after that. When we reached the nearest town, I called a tow truck for my vehicle, packed my things, and left. I never went back, and I never will. I'd been hiking alone for a week, the air thin and crisp as I trekked through the winding paths of the wilderness. My goal was simple: spend a few days lost in the quiet, away from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't mind the isolation. The only thing that bothered me was the constant reminder that the deeper you went into the forest, the less likely anyone would find you if something went wrong. But I liked it that way. The trail I was on wasn't part of any popular hiking circuit. It wasn't even really a trail in most places, just the remnants of an old logging path that hadn't been used in years. I knew the risks, but I felt confident I could handle it. The only thing I needed was a map, my backpack with essentials, water, food, a sleeping bag, a tent, and a sense of adventure. The quiet was better than any luxury I could imagine. The first day was easy, and by the time I set up camp in a small clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I had a view of the valley below, the mountains towering in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. Everything was peaceful. There were no signs of other hikers, no chatter, no civilization. Just me, the wilderness, and the sounds of the forest. I started a small fire, though it wasn't really necessary in the mild temperature. The crackling wood was a comfort. I ate some trail mix, drank water, and watched as the shadows grew longer. By the time the fire was reduced to a small glowing heap of embers, the sky was dark, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't the kind of feeling that would keep you awake, but just enough to make you aware of every noise. The snap of a twig in the distance, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It didn't help that I was alone. When you're on your own in the woods, the sounds can start to play tricks on you. Every snap of a branch could be an animal, or it could be something else. I'd read somewhere that the woods could make people paranoid. Some of it, they said, was just being away from everything, and some of it was the natural soundscape of forests. Things like wind and the creaking of trees that your mind misinterprets when you're isolated. I didn't know what it was, but by the time I zipped myself into my tent, the quiet felt oppressive. The night was long, and I didn't sleep much. At some point, I woke to a noise outside my tent, a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again, followed by a soft thud, like something had dropped onto the forest floor. I unzipped my tent just a crack and shone my flashlight around. Nothing. There was no sign of any animal, no movement. I hesitated, then let the flap fall back into place and tried to calm my racing thoughts. My mind played tricks in the dark, and I knew it. When morning came, I was still unsettled, but I forced myself to get up. The sounds of the night felt distant now, like they had never happened. The forest was silent again. Maybe the scraping had been an animal. Maybe I had imagined it. The second day of hiking was more challenging. The trail disappeared completely in some areas, leaving me to navigate by memory and the map. The forest was dense, thick with trees and the undergrowth that seemed to grab at your boots with every step. I had to crawl through some sections where the branches had grown over the path. The air was damp, and my breath came in puffs, visible against the chill. Around midday, I came across something strange. An old, rusted metal sign half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it. The sign was barely legible, but it looked like it had once been a trail marker. It was completely covered in moss and rust, like it had been here for decades. I tried to ignore it, but something about it unsettled me. No one had been out here in years, I thought. Yet there were signs, old trail markers, abandoned campsites, and now this sign, left in the middle of nowhere. It felt like a forgotten trail, but it wasn't entirely forgotten. I stood up and shook off the feeling. The trail was getting steeper, and I needed to focus. The afternoon sun was beginning to slip behind the trees, and I had a lot of ground to cover. The thought of another night alone in the woods was starting to press on my mind. By the time the sun was setting, I found a clearing near a stream to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, the water flowing softly over smooth stones, a peaceful place to end the day. I set up my tent quickly, lit a fire, and settled in with a small meal. But again, That uneasy feeling started creeping back. The forest was quiet, but there was something wrong about the silence. The creek gurgled in the background, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The shadows seemed deeper than before, the air heavier. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch, set my heart racing. I got into my tent early that night. The fire was dying down, and I zipped myself inside. The thin walls of the tent felt almost too thin. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind that made me freeze. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else, moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps were too deliberate. They didn't sound like the random, shifting motion of a wild animal. They were slow, almost as if someone was walking in circles around my camp. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. The footsteps continued, closer now. My throat felt tight. Was it a person? A hiker like me? Lost or searching for water? Or something else? I gripped my flashlight and waited, my breath shallow. The footsteps came again, closer now, just outside my tent. Then the scraping sound returned, the same one I had heard the night before. It was louder this time, like something or someone was dragging a heavy object across the ground. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I held perfectly still. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The scraping stopped. Then came the sound of something heavy being dropped onto the ground with a thud, just outside the tent. I could feel my whole body go cold. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark. What was it? The sounds stopped. The night grew eerily silent. I didn't dare go out to check. I stayed inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the night, my mind running wild with thoughts of what could be out there. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I was too afraid to leave my tent at first. I could see nothing unusual outside, but the entire day felt off. The campfire from the night before had been completely extinguished. The wind blew leaves across the ground, but nothing else moved. It was as though the entire forest had gone still, as though something or someone had taken control of the place. I packed up my camp quickly and left, my heart still pounding. As I walked through the woods, the unease never left me. There were no other signs of life, no animals, no other hikers, but something about the place had changed. The woods didn't feel empty. They felt haunted, as if every tree, every rock, every leaf was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to understand. I kept walking, the sound of my boots on the ground the only noise I could focus on. The trail stretched before me, dark and winding, but I didn't want to turn back. I needed to get out. I finally reached the main trail and saw the first sign of civilization, a worn-out sign marking the end of the forest. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop walking. I didn't look back. The woods were behind me now, but I knew I wouldn't forget what I had felt there. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about that place isn't right. Something about the woods stays with you, even after you leave.